today's event by remembering that the land we are on is the homeland of the Dakota people. The IAS recognizes that we are relatively newcomers in this space, and we honor and respect this place in recognition of all the Ojibwe and Dakota nations of Minnesota. So next week, IAS Thursday will not be in this room. We'll be upstairs in the Best Buy Theater, and our speaker will be Winifred Fowler Sullivan, who will be talking about teaching religion in public, rereading Abington versus Schempp for the 21st century. This is the Retzel Family Lecture in Religious Studies, and we invite you all to come back next week, but go up to the 4th floor in the Best Buy Theater. I want to thank our numerous co-sponsors for today's event, the Departments of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature, Asian Languages and Literature, German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch, Art and History, and the Center for Austrian Studies. So thank you very much for participating and supporting this event. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Katerina Clark, who is a native of Australia, and she's taught at the State University of New York, Buffalo, at Wesleyan University, the University of Texas at Austin, Indiana University, and Berkeley. She currently teaches at Yale, from which she earned her PhD. And she serves as the Director of Undergraduate Studies in Film and Media Studies, and has been the convener of a committee that for the past 15 years has organized an annual conference on European films. For 5 years, Professor Clark was a member of the core faculty for the Working Group on Contemporary Russian Culture, which was comprised of scholars from the US, Great Britain, and Russia, and it met annually to analyze trends in Russian film and literature. She has also served as the president of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And her publications include her books, The Soviet Novel, History as Ritual, Petersburg, Crucible of Cultural Revolution, and Moscow, The Fourth Rome, Stalinism, Cosmopolitanism, and the Evolution of Soviet Culture, 1931 to 1941. Her current book project is tentatively titled Eurasia Without Borders, ? Leftist Internationalists and Their Cultural Interactions, 1917 to 1943. Let's welcome Professor Katerina.
And thank you for inviting me to Minneapolis. I've never been here, and I've always wanted to see it. Unfortunately, I won't be here for very long, but I've enjoyed what I've seen so far. Arguably, a major lacuna in Pascal Casanova's account of world literature in the book Republic of Letters from 1999 is the Soviet project to found a world literature, a mirovaya literatura, that was most actively pursued between the wars. This project could be seen as a missing link, or at least a largely ignored link, in the progression from the more elitist world literature as conceived by Goethe and others in the early 19th century, and world literature in our post-colonial or post-post-colonial present that has preoccupied theorists in our era of globalization. The Soviet Union sought to found a kind of literary commons that would be centered in Moscow as metropole rather than Paris. At its height in the mid-1930s, most of the major writers in the Western world, and some in the non-Western, were members of its affiliated national bodies. Though progress in reaching their aim was often faltering, still what emerged progressively was the beginnings of a world literature, not the Paris-centered world literature of Casanova, but a Moscow-centered one. Casanova writes in her book for its international literary space, occupied by a sort of intellectual international. Today, I'm going to discuss Moscow-centered such international that was likewise formed around literature and enjoyed a significant presence in cultural history of the interwar years. It did not really embrace the world, however, in its entirety, and was in that sense not entirely world literature. Africa lay outside this cognitive map, which mostly extended to continental Asia, Europe, and North America, and at a stretch to Latin America as well. The incorporation of Africa came later, after World War II, When the Soviet Union became an active player in the Third World and African writers became prominent in a reconfigured intermediate nationalist movement. Some of the major African names in post-colonial culture, such as Ngugi and Sembène, were launched into the international arena in affiliation with this body, as Rosin Davlov has outlined in his forthcoming book, Premature Post-Colonialists, Soviet Literary and Cinematic Engagements with the Third World. But what is world literature? There have been effectively at least two, I think at least two is a gross exaggeration, rather more, understandings of the term, both present in Goethe's use of it, and prominent also in the current debates. One of them sees world literature in terms of an expansion of the circulation of texts and an expanded literary purview for the readers, geographical expansion, while others see world literature in a more qualitative terms as a sort of world historical or charismatic literature of a caliber worthy of transcending national readership, and also of transcending its historical moment. Some of the major theorists of world literature, such as Pascal Casanova, effectively hover between the two, a position made possible by her thesis that Paris was the capital of world literature and hence its literary elite, its critics and so forth, essentially set the standard, what she called the Greenwich meridian of literature throughout the world. They saw it naively, she says, and were, it quotes, in the thrall of the notion of literature as something pure, free, and universal, while in actuality both market and rivalries, capitalist narrative, have impelled the dynamic that led to this result. The idea of presiding over world-class literature guided a lot of internal Soviet literary policy during the 1930s, when a whole tribe of translators, many of them writers no longer able to publish their own works, were set to render in Russian and the languages of the minority peoples the great classics of world literature, and major works of the then contemporary transatlantic literature, a phenomenon described in my Moscow book as the great appropriation, that is, the appropriation for the nation of what was deemed great literature with the aim of national aggrandizement. But for Soviet authorities, literary politics could also be understood in terms of ideological merit, rather than strictly aesthetic, an aspect that Casanova chose to play down in her account of world literature, where she insists that the political and economic power were not decisive factors for the literary, utteranceing her argument by pointing out that Venice was the more powerful economically as compared with Florence, yet Florence generated a more brilliant culture. She also claims that, quotes, literary universe is relatively independent of the everyday world and its political divisions. In other words, the Soviet bid to preside over world literature was not just a rival enterprise parallel to the literary world that revolved around Paris, but had its own sui generis interests and formations. While Casanova described Paris as the great literary market in which writers from all over the world jostled for recognition, prestige, and sales, the Soviet Union intended to foster a world literature based in a post-market social order that was grounded in Marxist ideology and centered around Moscow as metropole. The seminal formulations for world literature of such leading theoreticians as Casanova and Moretti are inadequate, therefore, to cover the Soviet project because each of their theories depends on or is implicated in capitalist market forces at every level. The Soviet Union sought to create a new literature, explicitly to rival the capitalists, and through it to establish symbolic hegemony throughout the world as a facilitator of ideological hegemony and ultimately of a new socio-political order. Within the country, literature became, in the form of socialist realism, a medium for disseminating ideology in the official platforms of the masses. Externally, it became an instrument in the struggle for international ideological hegemony. But ideally, the two processes would be linked in a world literature. How do you affect emerging of literatures on a world scale without political or economic power? How could you institute a world literature that was to emerge from a political economic system that denies a role to the market? How could the Soviet symbolic forms compete in the marketplace given the paucity of material resources in the Soviet Union struggling to keep up economically with the West, with the added handicap that the Russian language was not widely known outside the country? Here also, Paris had an advantage. The answer to, and above all, what would be the mechanism for fostering the development of a Moscow-centered world literature? The answer to this question in practice was through a series of institutions and networks set up and funded by the state or the Comintern, and also through individual actions of individual actors and social intermediaries. In terms of state institutions, the most important was Vox, the All-Union Society for Cultural Links with Abroad, which was affiliated with the Foreign Ministry and typically had a representative in every Soviet embassy. So in some cases consulates, and so in some senses they were like cultural attachés. Vox oversaw cultural exchanges of all types, ranging from football teams to symphony orchestras, from writers to agriculturalists. But it's also involved in propagating Russian and Soviet literature. It sent care packages of books and journals from Moscow to individuals and institutions in foreign countries, and also commissioned translations to make it more possible for books they sent to be actually read. A much greater player in the area of world literature, however, was the Comintern. Effectively, the Soviet bid to establish a world literature emerged from their resolutions, starting with the Second Congress of the Comintern of July to August 1920. Then, at the Third Congress of the Comintern in 1921, a transnational literary body was proposed, Lit-Intern. In other words, the Literary International, as it were, the literary branch of the Comintern, which is the Communist International. One of a series of names for institutions they founded to foster an international literature. Though the name of this body kept changing over time, here I'm using the term Lit-Intern to refer to the international movement of leftist writers centered in Moscow. I'm just using the original term for all the subsequent versions of the body. In practice, the Moscow-oriented revolutionary literature was too weakly represented outside the Soviet Union initially, except in Germany, to really establish an international organization. The body sputtered on for the rest of the decade, and its reach did not really extend much beyond Berlin. But it was in 1930 at the Second International Congress of Writers held in Kharkiv that the movement really got going. And from then on, the leftist world literature would be formed, centered in Moscow. Part of the impetus for the recent, for this change was the recent worldwide depression that sent many of the left writers to take another look at the Soviet Union. Another reason for the shift is because literature became increasingly important to the Comintern, as after the failed German Revolution of 1923, and then the Shanghai debacle of 1927, when nationalist forces ousted the communists from China, it became apparent the proletarian revolution was not imminent. The Comintern did not hold a congress between 1928, the demoralized Comintern, one might say, did not hold a congress between 1928 and 1935, and in the interregnum, the commitment to world literature assumed a greater role, furthering the cause of Leftist International to a core. So, at Kharkiv itself, altogether 100 delegates from 23 countries participated. In the course of the conference, a new international body was formed, the International Union of Revolutionary Writers, IURW, or MORP in Russian, MORP. Over the next 5 years, all over the world, progressively more and more national bodies of leftist writers were formed, often called Progressive Writers Associations, and they opted to join MORP. Such as the British section of Writers International, which was formed in 1934, the Indian Progressive Writers Association, formed in 1935, the American Artists Congress that superseded the John Reach Club in 1935, and the Chinese actually had formed their body, the League of Leftist Writers, even earlier, before Kharkiv, in early 1930, but subsequently they voted to join this international body. Also, after Kharkiv, MORP set up a stable of semi-parallel journals as a stopgap measure, given the problem of lack of a lingua franca movement. Its Russian version, Internationalists, served as the mothership for counterparts in English, French, German, and for a time Spanish and Chinese. These journals contemporary literature, these published contemporary literature from other countries, primarily European, but also Asian, including in particular Indian and Chinese. Then there were semi-affiliated journals in other countries, such as New Masses in America, and New Writing and the Left Review in England. The publication and translation of literary texts by largely leftist contemporary writers in these journals was a prime mover in the bid to establish an alternative to what was centered in Paris. Another critical move was establishing publishing houses in the various countries that brought out both national and international works of both national and international leftists. In England, the publishing house in question was Martin Lawrence, a fictitious name that stood for Marx and Lenin, and was one such body, as was the International Publishers in Europe, and so on. Between the publishing houses and the local journals that were linked to Moscow, with this whole publishing network, this essentially compensated for the lack of a market and gave access for leftist writers in a range of countries to what their writers in other countries were writing. And so they functioned as incubators of a world literature. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, this led to a great expansion of the movement, which became closely associated with the anti-fascist cause. It's no accident that most of the radical writers' bodies affiliated with MORC were founded in 1934 and 1935, in other words, after the Nazi takeover. The mid-1930s marked the height of participation by foreign writers. Most of the major writers in Western countries were in some way affiliated with these bodies. In these years, there were two major international writers' congresses held in, quotes, in defense of culture, that is, against the fascists. The biggest was in Paris in 1935 and was followed by a hair-raising congress in Barcelona and Madrid of 1937, as Civil War bombs were raining down on the hotel where those were meeting. Technically, the International Union of Revolutionary Writers was dissolved after the Paris Congress, and a new international body, the International Association of Writers for the Defense of Culture, was set up, with its headquarters in Paris, as even overlooked example from Casanova. But de facto, both the funding and the supervision of this body came from Moscow. Within the Soviet Union itself, the management of international literature was transferred from Comintern-affiliated bodies to the Foreign Commission of the Writers' Union, though the commission had the same leadership, Mikhail Koltsov as head, Sergei Tretyakov as his deputy. In other words, the apparent shift of patronage was somewhat superficial. By this time, leading writers throughout the world, but especially in Europe and America, identified with or had joined the Soviet-centered literary effort as a literary international, if only because of its commitment to fascism. Symptomatically, Ian Forster, for example, headed the British delegation to the Paris Congress. Commitment to the anti-fascist cause could be described as the glue that unified the disparate writers in the movement, or as its lowest common denominator, for literary effort. In this, in turn, the publications, the criteria for publication for a positive evaluation of writers' work emerged as de facto to be support for the anti-fascist cause or some affiliation with the body linked to Moscow-centered leftist literary network. In consequence, one finds some unexpected inclusions in Internationalists Literature. The most striking example would be the publication in 1935 of Aldous Huxley's Braving the World, published in 1932. But as was stated explicitly in an accompanying editorial comment, this was because he was, quotes, a participant in the Paris Congress for the Defense of Culture and had been elected a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Writers. Casanova proposes a centrifugal model for world literature, as writers from all over the world are attracted to Paris as bees to a honeypot, whether or not they go there literally. While Moretti's model, the model of Franco Moretti in his writings, is more centrifugal or diffusionist, literary models travel out from the centers like Paris to the periphery. In the case of Lit in Turn, it might seem that we have something closer to the centrifugal model than to the centrifugal model, with writers' ideas and texts radiating out from Moscow to circulate throughout the world, leaving their mark in far-flung countries. But I don't want to give the impression here that leftist international literature between the wars was developed by Soviet-established institutions, that it was merely a top-down process. Many factors complicated any such model. For a start, though many national leftist literary organizations were affiliated with MORC, that did not mean that they followed MORC directives. Each organization was quasi-independent. Its members were often fluctuated, joined and left. And the organization were not operating in a silo. Secondly, though the speeches at the successive international congresses might seem to have been establishing a line for world literature, in practice often delegate skipped sessions, and in many instances the informal contacts they made at them, lateral connections, had a greater impact than the formal program. A striking example of this is the friendship formed at the Kharkov conference between the German communist writer Anders Zegers and the Chinese writer Emil Xiao. His first-hand accounts of, conveyed not in Chinese by the way, but in the language they both spoke, French, his accounts of the Shanghai uprising in 1937, in which he had led a contingent of workers, she uses in a series of long and short works that she published over the next 3 years. The coming together of writers at these talk fests and in the Progressive Writers Associations bespeaks a strong commitment to the anti-fascist movement, but what it was in turns original mandate to form a world literature of the left. How could that be achieved? The international literary journals potentially offered models for a new kind of writing, but not a coherent theory of what internationalist aesthetic. The guidelines for foreign international literature were largely outlined not at these international conferences, but at the first Congress of the Slavic Writers Union, held in 1934. In this Congress, Karl Reich delivered the speech dedicated to the question of foreign literature. It was titled Contemporary World Literature and the Tasks of Proletarian Art. In this speech, Reich followed what was already a standard procedure of Soviet literary criticism that played a major role in the formation of its canon. That is, the citing with commentary of positive and negative examples, in this case from foreign literature. The texts he promoted were not remotely socialist realist. Rather, they were by writers who had either declared their support for the Soviet Union or, more characteristically, were active in the anti-fascist movement, or were committed to the international anti-imperialist effort. In addition to speech, there were as is clear in the archives, literary bodies, journals, and individual writers incorporated in this net-in-turn network maintained a correspondence with the editor of Internationalists and Literature. The correspondence included writers from the British journals Left Review and New Writing, members of the Indian Progressive Writers Association, and affiliated American authors such as Richard Wright. But in the case of their journals, they received no Soviet funding, and often the editors struggled to make ends meet and to find publishers. Nor were they given instructions from Moscow as to what kind of literature they should publish, an exception being the frequent suggestion that they take into consideration the novels of Vanda Vasilevska, purportedly Tsar's mistress at the time, or, as Shota Rustaveli's Knight in the Tiger Skin, the 12th century national epic of Georgia, of Tsar's edited that had recently appeared in the Soviet Union in the new Russian translation, edited by Tsar. Such acts of fealty on the part of Soviet literary bureaucrats aside, I find remarkable the extent to which the relationship, though unequal, relationship between the mothership, Internationalists, and the affiliated journals, and in the periphery, though unequal, could not be characterized as top-down. The bureaucrats at the Foreign Commission and the editors of the Internationalists did not push for publishing, let alone emulating the classics of socialist realism, such as Fyodor Rodkov's Cement of 1935, or Nikolai Ostrovsky's How the Steel Was Tempered of 1932-4. And in fact, the Soviet writers who corresponded with Internationalists frequently did so in a bidding to get their own works published there. In other words, this network had some of the characteristics of the literary market that Casanova describes in the world of public letters, just that Moscow rather than Paris was its epicenter. Another complicating factor for positing a top-down novel, the writers of this in turn were not operating in silos. In the case of the principal authors of New Writing, for example, they had close connections with the writers of Bloomsbury, and their main interest was not in literature emanating from Moscow, but in the literary market of Britain, and secondarily in writers from other places in Western Europe. The German anti-fascist writers might seem to have been more subject to Moscow institutions after 1933, after the Nazis took over, and so many of them went into exile. All the more so since the various emigre periodicals and publishing houses that they established abroad struggled to become solvent and mostly sputtered and died. But the Soviet Union provided 3 periodicals for them, which are housed and financed in Moscow and widely distributed in the diaspora. The German version of Internationale Literature, Das Wort, it is partially by Brecht, and Deutsche Zentralzeitung. But this relationship of dependency did not mean that its editors and contributors became what Max Eastman called in his 1974 book of this title, artists in uniform. Johannes Becker, the chief editor of Internationale Literature from 1933 to 1945, though he lived in an apartment building for Soviet writers, refused to learn Russian because he saw himself as a champion of German culture, did not want Russian culture to change his work. This raises a general problem for those seeking to institute a common leftist world literature: how to calibrate the national tradition with the international. Branko Moretti, in his 2 seminal articles, Conjectures in World Literature, published in the New Left Review in 2000, and More Conjectures, published in 2003, attempts to model the process whereby the text from the center, and he has in mind, in particular, popular novels for text, are assimilated in the periphery, but he has trouble coming up with a stable account of this dynamic, and fudges a little. Moretti says, quotes, when a culture from the periphery starts moving towards a model, when a culture from the center starts moving towards the periphery, it's always a compromise between what he calls foreign form and local materials, a somewhat vague term, materials. At other times he says, the story comes from the core, from the center, and it reaches the periphery. And when it reaches the periphery, it has to contend with local viewpoints. And another, again, he enlarges the dyad to a triad: foreign form, local material, and local form, simplifying somewhat foreign plot, local characters, and then local narrative voice. In other words, he never really quite managed the problem. Moretti posits an antagonistic relationship between the literatures of the core and the periphery, a story of struggle and of the resistance of materials on the periphery to being subsumed under some metropolitan form, sometimes expressed in an ironic re-reflection. As he puts it, quotes, the pressure from the Anglo-French core tried to make literature on the periphery meld with literature at the center, but it could never fully erase the reality of difference. The bureaucrats and idealists who ran lit in turn came up against a similar dilemma. During the 1930s, the Soviet project for world literature did not entail the market-driven evolutionary model of immersion. Guidelines were provided for the direction of international literature by Radek at the Writers' Congress. Radek, in his speech to the Congress, provided some specific aesthetic as distinct from realpolitik principles that were to apply to foreign literature, no less than to Soviet. Towards the end of his speech, he confronted foreign writers with a choice encapsulated in one of his subheadings: James Joyce or socialist realism. This section of the address became a milestone moment in the prehistory of a binary that was to define so much cultural activity during the Cold War, when, along with Clement Greenberg and the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom, the West began championing modernism and to deprecate realism, the ism that was assiduously promoted in the Soviet bloc. Clement Greenberg's essay, Modernist Painting, was originally given as a radio broadcast in 1961 for the Voice of America's Foreign Lectures, and so was, from its very inception, politically implicated. In this essay, which achieved a canonical status, Greenberg contends that a work of art must be analyzed in terms of its inherent properties and purposes, which must preclude applying any non-essential or external criteria. Realism, storytelling, and illusionism should all be eliminated for art. Our work's raison d'etre was to call attention to itself as art. Truly modernist art, he contended, would abandon the principle of representation and together with it, subject matter, content, figuration, illusionism, and narrative. Content was to become completely dissolved in form. Greenberg's position then is comparable with the one taken by Russian formalists in their heyday of the early 1920s, when they argued against the importance of content in the work of art. During the 1930s, however, the Soviet and the Western camps in culture had not formed lines of absolute aesthetic demarcation. And the Soviet Union actually, the prescription of Joyce and company, even in the Soviet Union, was not as universally accepted as one might expect. In 1935, after the Writers' Union Congress, in other words, Internationalists and Literature under Tretyakov began publishing Ulysses in Russian translation in serial installments that continued until April 1936. The project was abandoned when in January and February 1936, several unsigned and therefore more authoritative articles appeared in Pravda attacking what one might call, to generalize, modernist art, and included Shostakovich's ballet, The Limpid Stream, his opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, the theatre of Vsevolod Meyerhold, and modernist architecture. The articles launched the anti-formalist, so-called anti-formalist campaign, generally classified as an attack not on formalism, the formalist movement, long abandoned, but on modernism. Until this point, however, it was to be noted the mothership of Literature terms, fleet of journals, Internationalists and Literature, was not following the official guidelines for an international literature. There was intense, in fact, an intense intra-leftist debate about formalism, to be found most famously in the so-called expressionism debate. They pitted Brecht against Bloch and other champions of the avant-garde against Yuri Lukács and his associates. But with actually a reprise of an even earlier debate that had taken place in Berlin's more affiliated journal of literary theory, Linkskurve. This particular prophecy was then centered around the central axis of communist intellectual world that extended from Moscow to Berlin. So central, in fact, that Berlin has to be categorized using Moretti's model, not as a periphery, but by his third category, the semi-periphery. The rest of Europe were, however, outliers, truly a periphery in this debate, and paid little attention, as they also did to Radek's address, incidentally. It was very scantily covered in the European press, and his central challenge, James Joyce, the socialist realism, was completely ignored. Tretyakov then was far from the only member of Literature to push back against the prescription of James Joyce coming from official platform. Many writers followed, for example, the literary techniques of another modernist, Dos Passos, whom, though until 1930s was still a leftist, Radek condemned as too much, quotes, under the influence of James Joyce. A notable example would be the fiction of the communist writer Anna Segas, whom I've already mentioned, whose works were in the 1930s published in leftist journals throughout the world. Rather than subordinate her text to an overriding narrative trajectory, Segas, following Dos Passos in Manhattan Transfer, used a montage technique of ongoing narrative strands with unmotivated breaks between them. And in the name of conveying lived experience, she used many distinctively modernist formal strategies such as subjective narration, stream of consciousness, multiple perspectives, and free indirect discourse. Often, the identity of a given speaker is not explicit, or the inner thoughts of characters run counter to the positions they take in conversations with colleagues, with political comrades. This approach, the privileging of inner experience and thoughts, was criticized by Radek in his speech, though he associated more with Proust than with Joyce. Proust, he complained, wants to describe every slightest movement of the person, to convey the psychology of his heroes, the heroes of the French salon, by quite delicately dissecting their souls. Radek, typical of authority speech at the time, the Soviet speakers at the time, wanted character depiction to be subordinated to an overarching plot, and thereby totally objective. Like Segas, members of Literature characteristically ignored or even actively opposed particular taboos presented at the Writers' Union Congress. The most striking among them would be the ban on introducing what Radek called naturalism or physiologism, a euphemism for sexual content. Leading British leftist writers, for example, many of whom were gay or bisexual, such as Auden, Isherwood, and the editor of New Writing, John Lehman, mounted spirited defenses of the then banned text boy, and the well of loneliness, while contraband copies of Joyce's Ulysses and of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, both casualties of the British censors, were sold under the table at London leftist bookshops. In France, Gide looked to the Soviet Union because he believed, mistakenly as it turned out, that homosexuality was tolerated there. Many in the elite in turn believed that to be radical politically was to adopt radical sexual mores. Even the Indian writers championed this. Many of their readers were shocked by the explicit sexual content in a collection of short stories they put out on Beret that was edited inter alia by Zajad Sahir. Published in 1932, Angare was banned in 1933 by the British government of India, who were not amused either. This fate of the anthology led in part to the establishment in 1935 of a more affiliated All India Progressive Writers Association, of which Tahir was the co-founder. With so many qualifications, exceptions then, are we really looking at an example of the world literature? I would argue yes. After all, the world literature does not have to be homogeneous, and nor does it have to operate in a homogeneous literary world. The dynamic I've identified here is in some ways comparable with the one that Antoinette Burton and Isabel Hoffmeyer discuss in their introduction to their edited collection, 10 Books That Shaped the British Empire, Creating an Imperial Commons. As Burton and Hoffmeyer point out, and was certainly true of Lytton Terran, quotes, the Imperial Commons was far from uniform, but both integrated intellectually and perpetually disintegrated by the myriad of subjects and agents who constructed, lived inside, and sought to exceed its territorial and epistemological frames. Thank you. Any questions?
Do you want to field your own questions?
First of all, thank you very much for that talk. I have several questions, but I'll stick to just one. I wonder if you have any time for the kind of intervention in theorizing world literature that the Warwick Research Collective, the Neil Lazarus, Benita Barry, that group, that they tried to propose that there is something tumor at this project in thinking of world literature as sort of organized around the center, periphery, and semi-periphery model, but that it doesn't actually take account of the combined and uneven development argument.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. So that there is another way maybe to think about the project of world literature around that problematic of combined and uneven development.
Right, that's absolutely true. Of course, I haven't particularly covered Asian. This is a rapid Fuchs tour around the subject, so I haven't covered that problem at all. But absolutely, yes.
In that case, can I follow up with another question? Because I was caught by your comment about this whole problematic of James Joyce or socialist realism. That sort of hovers around the question of modernism, doesn't it? The politics of modernism, as Williams would put it. So, in your work, and as you sort of conceptualize the larger project, is there a place for a kind of a modernism that emerges after realism that might be accommodated within a Soviet or leftist international project?
Now, what would you? I actually hate to use the word modernism, which I believe is a very many-splendored thing.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure what the post-realist modernism would be. What did you have in mind?
Well, I'm just thinking about the kind of hostility to modernism in someone like many people, but of course the whole debate around expressionism, the Blau writer group, and all those people from the 30s onwards and well into the 60s and 70s, the figures associated with the British, the predecessor of New Left Review, the Left Review, and those figures kind of digs its own grave when it tries to sort of move to the periphery or move to anything outside of the bourgeois world of the psychological novel, let's say, or sound poetry, or any of these sort of imagistic forms of fragmentary writing. So I'm just trying to see if you have any thoughts on how that might actually organize the problematic of a leftist international after that moment. You know, where does modernism, or where does the sort of reprise of modernism happen, if it does at all, in the Soviet organized system? And does, for instance, Tretyakov have anything to say after he has been banished to left letters, or World Republic of Letters that's informed by a kind of a Soviet critique?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer your question very well, but I mean, there are lots of examples on the ground in the 1920s and 1930s. Take a case like Nazım Hikmet, the Turkish poet, who was heavily influenced by Mayakovsky, so we have Mayakovsky in the first place. So there are many examples on the ground of writers who were not by any stretch of imagination in the real school. And of course, Mayakovsky survived, and he was adopted by Stalin and became an emblematic poet of the Soviet Union, paradoxically. But he had enormous influence on the literary left of actually of Asian writers in particular in the early 1920s. He was very actively involved with them in Moscow and had enormous subsequent influence. I don't know if that answers your question at all. I think you're looking more at the present day.
No, not really. That does answer some of it.
So in other words, there always, I mean, there are different versions, but there always is this alternative strain that always was present. And it was very strongly present in the early 1920s. Hikmet and Mayakovsky and others focused on the sound qualities of poetry, for example, rather than on meaning. And there has almost a millenarian aspect to poetry in their articulation.
Just a question about, thank you for paying attention to the, thank you for putting attention on the links between the political and the economic structures and the literary structures here. And I want to ask a question about that, just a very basic question, which is about translation. Thinking about the many translators that is involved and the multilingual skills that's involved. And to ask, so it sounds like you said that the Comintern for Literature was not funding journals in the US and Britain. But was there funding for translators? Was there training for translators? Were there infrastructures around making translation happen?
Well, they were in the Soviet Union. There was a cottage industry. In fact, cottage industry was a factory in the Soviet Union. But that was not directed by the Comintern. It was much more Vox and also the Writers' Union, principally the Writers' Union. So that the Soviet translation in the Soviet Union was usually done in the following way: that a native speaker of the given language would present a line translation, and then an accomplished poet would render the line translation in poetry words. That was the difference. So that's already very heavy, because you're getting two person people every poem to translate every poem. So there's a huge, enormous investment that they made in this period. And as I say, they weren't only translating into Russian, they were also translating, to a less extent, but they were translating into languages of the minority peoples as well. So the same text might be multiply translated. Same foreign text might be multiply translated into different languages of the Soviet Union, which there were very many. Any other questions?
Well, could I just follow up and ask, also, were they translating into, say, English, French, etc. in Moscow? Where were the centers of translation from Russian? Was that mostly in the North Russian level?
Well, from Russian, there was a publishing house in Moscow which had a lot of often the wives of foreign communists, most characteristically the wives of foreign communists got their employment in this office, and they would translate into their Russian text into their native language. So that was in general what happened. But there's also translation, of course. As I perhaps didn't indicate sufficiently, but many foreign texts were published by leftists, were published in various countries by the initiative of the writers and the journals themselves, in which case they would have to organize translation, which was a very expensive proposition, especially given that they were struggling financially. But they did. And so in many cases the translation was made without recompense, compensation. Yeah.
I have a question. You were mentioning African writers like Sunding and others, and particularly after the kind of Chinese-Russian split, is there any reevaluation of relationships with with these growing independent former colonies, and do the Chinese see the literary form and world as important in their own framework as the Soviet Union does?
I can't answer that question at all. but after the Sino, one of the important factors in the 1930s was the presence in Moscow of a large number of Chinese, of revolutionary Chinese, many of whom married Russians, and often the men married Russian wives. After the Revolution of '49, or other different points, they repatriated to China, bringing with them their foreign wives. When the Sino-Soviet split occurred, and also during the Cultural Revolution, many of these figures, wives with husbands as well, were imprisoned. Does that answer your question at all? And of course, there's the total reevaluation because until that point, a great deal of Russian culture was reduced in China, and the split meant a cultural split as well, and it meant a denigration even of Russian material. But the Chinese independence from Soviet influence dates well before that point in time. You can see it in the late 1930s during the Sino-Japanese War in particular. There's a lot of loud statements, and if you look closely at his thesis on literature and the arts, delivered in Yan'an in 1942, which for decades was the principal canonical source for literature in the PRC. There's a delicate dance that goes on in the course of those statements on literature and the arts, theses on literature and the arts. But in general, he's marking himself off from Soviet examples in the course of the theses. Yes.
In your opinion, was there any cross-pollination between these, let's say, two republics of letters, the Western one and the Soviet one, in the 20s and 30s? I'm thinking of, the SUNY, like Roman Forum or Herbert Wells. Was their connection to the Soviet Union influential in any sort of way? Did that connection inform their circles or not?
Right. Well, of course, you have to periodize. You have to look at different moments, the historical moments. But if you take the Paris Congress of 1965, in some ways, the two world literatures come together in Paris in 1965. not completely, because one of the obsessions of the Paris Congress in 1935 was the surrealists, who were excluded from the proceedings. So you have an overlap, but it's not a complete match at that point, and that's probably the point of greatest building of Casanova's Republic and the Moscow Republic. That was a high point. That was the high point of what I'm describing here in terms. It was the 1935 Congress and the year 1935 in general. There's no accident that so many of these affiliated bodies formed in 1935. But in 1936, you're already getting the beginnings of the purges. You're already getting the countdown on modernism that I mentioned, beginning of the purges. You're getting the Spanish Civil War, and the Soviet, as writers became more and more aware of some of the darker aspects of the conduct, the Soviet conduct within the Spanish Civil War, there were defections. So they're progressively up. 35 is the high point, and starting in 36, you progressively get defections. Thus, Casas, whom I mentioned, he defected because he was a very extremely one of his friends was executed in the Spanish Civil War, and so on. But then, of course, in the Second World War, there's this right, and then you're going in after that, you're going into the whole.
That's not much.
But it's extraordinary to me. You read the list of people who belong to these Moscow-affiliated literary organizations. Klient's books and so on. The names of people who belong to these Moscow-related literary organizations is really quite astounding. And it's basically this presents a who's who in literature of the mid-30s. And then it's only a question of what point they peel off. They don't, of course, all peel off, but the majority of the major names do peel off.
Just a quick follow-up, and this is not much of a question. Does the figure of Ilya Ehrenburg help trace any of this at all?
Well, of course, you're talking about Paris and Moscow. Ehrenburg is a major Soviet writer of the interwar period and also of the post-war period. But he resided in Paris for almost the entire interwar period. He was Jewish, and so when the Germans took Paris in 1940, he returned to the Soviet Union. But until that point, he actually resided. He had a Soviet passport, residing in Paris. But he was a major organizer of the Paris Congress in 1935. And he, together with Mongolia, who was extremely involved in the literature in these years, and through the Spanish Civil War as well, Mongolia, they together were among the prime organizers of the 1935 Paris Congress. So yes, and of course he, however, was very close to Picasso and various other figures in the avant-garde, but including the surrealists. So this created problems for him. That's period. Picasso was more accessible, despite the fact that his work's not particularly figurative. He was associated with communists, and so for this reason his work remained acceptable. Not to say it's highly praised.
Rivera also worked.
But
Rivera. The artist.
Diego Rivera.
Diego Rivera.
Rivera, yes. Rivera. Latin America really only comes into the purview of literature with the Spanish Civil War, in fact. At which point they also start to bring out one of their journals in Spanish, temporarily during the course of the war. So until that point, essentially Latin America was scarcely known. Although Rivera did come to Moscow in 1927, at the time of the first Congress of International Congress of Writers, but he was involved with the artists writing. But he did come in 27, which was the 10th anniversary of the revolution, which is why they had this Congress of Writers in 27. It was the 10th anniversary of the plan.
Professor Clark will be around for a few minutes if you have further questions or want to speak with her personally. And let's give her a big hand and thank her so much for